Well, as you know, if you've joined us for prior core coffee chats or conversations, we will start out with a brief overview of core, but today our topic is racial equity in crisis planning and decision making with an eye towards the future as well. We're very fortunate to have Hannah Garcia with us, who's been on a prior core conversation about racial equity. Hi, Hannah. Thanks for
Hello,
joining us
everyone.
today.
Thanks for
Many of you
having
already know
me.
Hannah either from work with the Arts Council or prior core work, and she's also worked intensively with the core steering committee. So today you'll hear more about the tools that we've used within core and that we hope will be useful to you and your own organizations as well. So many of you are already familiar with core, the collective of results and evidence-based investments. It started out as a funding model for the city and county of Santa Cruz, but has grown to be a broader movement to achieve equitable health and well-being in our county using a results-based collective impact approach. It's responsive to our emerging and evolving community needs. So a collective impact approach is another terminology that many of you may be familiar with. And it has these elements that you see on the slide. I won't go over them, but if you've heard the term collective impact, this is the kind of thing that it's referring to. And that the core fits into this broader framework that's used by cities, counties, regions all over the country, and in fact, all over the world to try to achieve an impact that applies across broader sectors and achieves more impact than could be accomplished by any one organization acting alone. So within core, we've worked with a lot of different partners, some of you on the call, a lot of people outside of the call and across different sectors in the county to try to achieve the results that collective impact envisions. So when Nicole and I look at these slides now, we're sort of startled to see people close together at tables like this. It just feels like something from a very distant past. But this is just to illustrate the kinds of core conversations we were able to have live, small groups, large groups, a lot of input and feedback on what became the core mission and vision that you see on this slide. All of these have equity at the center, which is relevant to today's call in particular, but has been part of core since its inception. And so you can see that from these definitions, how equity is featured in both the mission and vision statements. So when we talk about achieving equitable health and well-being, what we mean is that anyone across the lifespan has an equitable opportunity to experience these 8 core conditions, which I'll go over more in just a moment. They're all connected and interdependent, and the goal of equitable health and well-being means that the opportunities for these shouldn't be predictable or dictated by anyone's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, immigration status, zip code, any of those things. So connecting these to today's core conversation, as I mentioned, racial equity is central to everything that we do in core. In many American cities and towns, including ours, racist lending policies and redlining have meant that people of color haven't been able to live in safe, affordable housing. They may not have benefited from the appreciation in real estate values and the accumulation of wealth over generations that many white households have been able to take for granted. That and other advantages give many white families economic security and mobility that are still out of reach for people of color. And the passage of time and these historical inequities only make things worse. Because property values and taxes drive other investments, people of color may be educated in underfunded schools, and that affects their lifetime earnings and economic stability once again. They're also more likely to be living in unhealthy environments with exposure to things like pollution, pesticides, lead, asbestos. And their encounters with the criminal justice system, as George Floyd and many others have tragically shown, are as far as they can be from being safe and just, and they're often fatal. For almost any health condition, from birth to diabetes, to cancer, to COVID-19, which we're dealing with right now, people of color experience worse outcomes than white people. And because all of these core conditions are interdependent, when these inequities converge, as they often do, they destroy the threads of community connectedness and the ability of families to thrive free of fear and trauma. So that's just one reason why equity is at the center of this diagram of the core conditions. And all of the conditions are connected in other ways as well. But whenever they're connected, the path goes through this filter of equity. And it's also why equity is one of our core values. So we've got it listed here and explain a little bit about how we try to demonstrate this value in everything that CORE does in terms of uncovering root causes of inequities and disrupting the practices and structures that perpetuate them. So the CORE Steering Committee, we have a few members from our CORE Steering Committee on today's chat, has been exploring the role of equity and racial equity in particular since its inception. So we started out with a core conversation and some exploration in the steering committee about what equity means and how it could be operationalized for CORE. We moved on to some broader reviews of the draft vision and mission and value statements that you just saw. And a lot of the feedback was to make equity more prominent than it was. So that's been another factor in how this is described. And then we had a second core conversation where we got broader community feedback from hundreds of people on these statements and what they could mean for CORE and the core conditions. Then we had a presentation to the steering committee on wage equity, and that's been one of several ways that the steering committee has tried to bring these issues into its discussions on a regular basis. We also had a discussion by equity trainers locally, which is Hannah and Maria Gomez-Contreras, who's also joining us on the call today, at a broader core conversation, as well as working intensively with the steering committee. And we also had a variety of discussions within the steering committee about how to operationalize equity within their own organizations. And those are some of the tools that you'll be seeing today as well. In January, the steering committee, January of this year, before we all had to shelter in place for COVID-19, we had an equity dialogue and retreat with the help from Hannah and Maria as well. And those are some of the themes that you'll hear again today. So this is just to illustrate that this is not a new issue for CORE. So one of the things that we discussed during these steering committee meetings is this graphic from the Race Matters Institute continuum showing the progression from diversity and inclusion to equity focused on results. And Hannah will go over this as well, but this is something that may be familiar to you, but it's just trying to show that it's not just the quantity, but also the quality and including power and voice within organizational culture is particularly relevant to our discussion today, and then all of that leading to different results. Working with Hannah and Mireya, we also came up with this working definition of racial equity for CORE, concentrating on closing gaps, as I mentioned earlier, so that race no longer predicts success or outcomes. And the second part of this definition is to center our work in communities of color so that improvements are targeted for those who are most affected by racial inequities. And also it means moving beyond services to transform the policies, institutions, and structures that lead to these inequities. So with that, we'll turn our discussion over to Hannah in just a moment, but I just wanted to reiterate that our conversation today as part of CORE is a series of coffee chats that maybe you've been participating in for the last couple months. We're trying to hold them weekly, and those are part of a larger effort to build capacity locally by sharing information, sometimes on really practical topics like how to do a Zoom meeting or how to use data share, and others that are much more reflective and go deeper, like this conversation today. So all of that is part of a broader umbrella of capacity building that we're calling the Core Institute for Innovation and Impact. So we're very pleased to have all of you with us today, and we hope to have you with us in future chats as well. So with that, I'll turn things over to Nicole Young, who's going to introduce Hannah.
Great, thank you. And if you haven't yet had the chance to meet or work directly with Hannah Garcia, you are in for a treat today. Every time that Nicole, Lezin, and I have talked with her, in the course of planning this and other core conversations and trainings on racial equity, we just end up feeling really inspired and grateful for the kind of passion and knowledge and experience that Hannah has in this area. And she has a lot of great tools and guides for us today that I think will be helpful not only today, but in all of our work on an everyday basis. And so very pleased to introduce Hannah Garcia, who is currently the grants manager for the Arts Council Santa Cruz County, and also a racial equity consultant. And Hannah has been working with us now for a little over a year. I think it's when we first started, along with Mireya Gomez Contreras, who I believe is on this call. Mireya, do you want to say hi really quickly so that you show up on the screen?
Hi, good to be here.
There she is. Yes.
Hi, Mireya.
And Caitlin Brune, who I don't think is on today's call, but the three of them have been working closely with Nicole and I to really figure out how do we work with not only the core steering committee, but again, the broader community to really make equity, racial equity in particular, a central part of our core investments work. And so I am going to leave it at that because Hannah has a lot planned for us today. And Hannah, I believe you should be able to go ahead and share your screen and get us started.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that sweet introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. I am really, really excited to start this conversation with you. And I think it's something that we've been thinking about so much in our organization. So I'll hopefully have some useful stories for you, but I think we'll have time for a little bit of dialogue, a little activity, a little breaking out, and also just some kind of sharing of what I've learned through this work so far. So I'm just going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation for today. And I'll start off with sharing the agenda that I had in mind for us today. So we'll talk a little bit about values and agreements and how important that is for kind of setting the stage for our equity work, what the kind of landscape is looking like right now, just taking into consideration the impacts of COVID-19 on communities of color and how that's impacting racial disparities. Some of the tools I think that are so valuable for this work is a racial equity impact assessment. There's different frameworks and practices for centering community in this work, since that's really what equity is so much about. Identifying what are our kind of key decision-making points as we're in this crisis planning, as we're making so many pivots in our work. How do I identify what are those key decision-making points? And then practice using a racial equity lens for our work. So that's what we'll have time for today in a couple of hours. And I so appreciate everybody just adding in as they, first jumped in. What are you most interested in learning? And I think one of my big questions I'd have for you is, what questions get answered through this time together? And then what questions are still lasting? And I think that could really help inform what the next core conversation could be around equity. So I will just move us along. The main goals that I have for this talk is just to make sure that we understand the societal and racial impacts related to COVID-19, some of the best practices, and then applying some of those racial equity tools and practicing. And I think so much of what we're doing is so fast-paced, right? I think in nonprofits in general, we're very, very busy. And then I think to add, a pandemic on top of that just really accelerates the work. I know I've been busier, and I would just love to see a show of hands. Just raise your hand if you've gotten busier during this time of COVID-19. Yep. a lot of people. And so there's so much value. I know a lot of us are mindfulness practitioners and appreciate mindfulness, but just to take a pause. So much of the work related to equity is to interrupt and pause the typical systems and structures that we're so well trained into, so well conditioned into. So we are actually deep, we're being really asked right now in society, and I think with everything happening, to just take a pause, find a moment to pause. So I wanted to create a little time for us to do that now. So if whether you have a mindfulness practice or not, it's just helpful to start off by just making sure both of your feet are on the floor, or if you're in a cross-legged seated position, that your seat is on something solid. And just to, you can kind of place your hands on your lap or on your knees or just wherever they rest comfortably. And if it's helpful to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If it's helpful just to kind of look down and just to kind of keep your eyes away from the distraction of the screen. And just notice your breath. Just notice what's happening, just how you're feeling today, how you're arriving. And it's all okay, whatever comes up, whatever you're feeling, if your mind is racing, if you're feeling calm, if you're thinking about what you ate today, whatever, it's just helpful to just sit and just notice. And then just regularly bring your attention to just your breath and your body. How it feels to just take one breath in and one breath out. And we'll be here for just a couple minutes, and I'll set a bell for when we're done. But just taking a moment to just let yourself rest for a moment, and just let yourself kind of connect to your body and your breath. So just take a big deep breath. And then as you open your eyes, just kind of look around at your surroundings and notice if there's something in the space that you're in that you like, maybe something that's pretty or just something that draws your attention. And then just kind of bring yourself back to where you are now, and that you're joined in a virtual workshop with many other peers and friends. How was that for folks? Good. Yeah, I think thank you for the thumbs up. Yeah, let's see some more thumbs. How was just thumbs up if that was nice to take a little break. Awesome. Yay. Yes, I think for me, this is like my saving grace right now. And I don't always find time to do it, but when I do, it's just, it makes such a difference. And even now, I'm like, oh, wow, I really feel arrived in my body. So I think grounding, whatever practice, I think so many of us have different practices that help ground us and get us in our body. But essentially, this pause, that we take personally for ourselves is something that I want to encourage that we also bring into our organizations, into the culture of our organizations. Because when we pause, we come back to things with more grounding, more thoughtfulness, and just more full selves. So I love to use that as a foundation for our work. And I wanted to just ground us a little bit in values, because so much of our work is guided by what we care about. And oftentimes when we're busy and in crisis mode, or just in the busy day to day of our lives and schedules, we don't always get a chance to always live our values, right? And I think sometimes our organizations can even sometimes be so busy that some of our values get hit on a regular basis, maybe some don't. So I wanted to invite you to share in the chat box, just to start, what is one of your core values that kind of guides you in your work? That's great. Inclusion, authenticity, well-being, equity, compassion and service, honesty, relationship. That's a great one. Kindness, reducing oppression. Great. These are all great equity values. This is great. Service, tolerance, compassion. Beautiful. Now I want to ask you, just to kind of get a sense, what is a core value for your organization? What do you know, when you think about the culture of your organization, what's kind of a core value that drives your work? Dignity, service-oriented healthcare for all, respect, person first, equity, social services, equality and equity, empowering women, social justice, collaboration. These are beautiful. I mean, this is so much of the reason why we do this work, right? And so much of these values are, I think, critical for our work being impactful. And then, just in the conversation of equity, these are critical values to presence at the table. And I think, sometimes what can happen, is that we can be really upfront, with our mission, vision, and values about the values that we, really want to maintain and work towards. And I think when it comes to, measuring equity, we don't always have the most equitable results in our organizations and in our community. There might be maybe to some degree inside organizations or inside a program, but ultimately in our community, we've got a lot of inequities to tackle, right? And so there can be a misalignment between the values that we set and some of the conditions that we're working in, right, inside of our communities, inside of our work. So our values become that much more important. So I think part of the grounding of our work, kind of taking the pause to ground into our values and making sure that our decisions are coming from really from our heart and our values. So thank you so much, everyone, for just sharing. And I just wanted to share, as a way to kind of open us up, that there are some really great values and agreements that we can set for how we interact with each other in workspaces. So meeting agreements are often kind of our group values, or how, what are our values for working together. So I'll just kind of share a few agreements for creating a kind of brave and inclusive space. And I think the goal is, inside of these is not always to agree, but is to gain a deeper understanding with each other. And, especially as we work with new perspectives and new agendas, that tension and conflict can often be opportunities for growth and expansion. Often can push kind of the edges of, what we're traditionally used to doing. So here are some agreements I'd love to share with you about creating a brave and inclusive space that you can use in your organization, but that I always like to use to guide any workshops. And a lot of you are familiar with most of these. A big one is share the air, just making sure that, we're small groups and as a large group, so much of us have so much to say. I think for those of us who are a little bit more, tend to be more, do more of the speaking in a room, we know who we are. And those of us who are shy, we know who we are. So the invitation is for folks who tend to, maybe go on monologues, or who tend to have so much to share, maybe to take a little step back. And for folks who are shy, or to take a step a little bit forward and just share what's on your mind and what's on your heart, so that we share space and that we're working together. That we, keep what we share confidential, that we take risks in trying out new things, that we welcome the multiple viewpoints that are in the space with us together. We listen fully and be present. We don't get too distracted by maybe what's happening on our phone and our emails and maybe all the other multitudes of things grasping for our attention. And we embrace curiosity. There's so many new topics and new ways to do this work. And I think so much we're learning about how to be more effective around our equity and inclusion work. So being curious is, I think, really, really helpful, especially when we've got such hard challenges to tackle. I think curiosity is kind of the opposite of just, maybe a cynicism, I think, that can build around like, just how challenging I think the work can be. So curious about the innovation that can happen. I think another helpful one is just to make sure that, we speak from our own experience. When, we're with people in the same group, we don't speak for anybody in our group. That helps to kind of maintain a good impact, and making sure that we're all speaking for ourselves. Intent versus impact is another really important one. That if we ever share anything, or if we're engaging with one another and something that we say causes harm for another, that we just recognize that we all really have the best of intentions. We're all learning and grappling with this work together, and that we acknowledge when there's impact. The intentions can be really good, but sometimes the impact can not always land the way we want. So it's helpful to just say, sorry, acknowledge impact, and move on. Trust the process. We're not going to solve all of the world's injustices in a 2.5-hour core conversation, even though I would love for that to happen. That so much of our work, at least from my work at the Arts Council, we started our equity work, at least for me, I started 3 years ago, and it's a 3-year process and growing. And so we're in a constant learning and evolving process. To lean into discomfort, so many of the topics as we get into conversations with equity, particularly if this is a newer conversation for folks, we can be less skilled in talking about them or in analyzing them or working with them. So just to lean into the discomfort of learning something new, or lean into the discomfort of discussing something with new people. To relate and connect to the folks with you, and to leave nobody behind. We're all in this together, and we can only really go as far as the pace of trust, I think, between people. So those are some shared agreements. If there's anything folks would like to add, I'd love if there's just anything you want to include to add in the chat box, if you think anything might be missing. Okay. Then if this all sounds good, maybe just a thumbs up either in your screen, or you might have the little emotions you can click on, or reactions, a little thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Cool. And I think a lot of you probably do use shared agreements in your work, so these are just a list if you find it useful. But one of the reasons I think this is so important is I think, this is a kind of a framework for how change happens. And I think a lot of us, this is intuitively true for us, is that it often starts in the heart and mind. And, what our values are informs what our behaviors are. And then what our behaviors are as a collective inform our structures. And then structures can then influence hearts and minds. And so it's a whole wheel of change. And so you can kind of interrupt it at any place, but it's really helpful to ground and kind of where our hearts and minds around this work. So that's why I wanted to start us off with values. And I just want to move to kind of talking a little bit about what's happening right now with COVID-19. I think a lot of you are, working with organizations that are on the front lines in some form or another. All of us are being impacted by what's happening with the pandemic. And so I thought it was just helpful to ground us. A lot of you might know what the racial disparities are, but we've got really disproportionate impacts on communities of color and other communities that tend to be in the margins. So it's really helpful, I think, when we think about our COVID planning is, if we have, somewhere in our mission, if we say all, I think this work becomes really mission critical, because if our work is working towards all, but we've got really deep disparities in our communities or really deep impacts happening for some of our constituents, then we really have to take a look at that. It's not optional. And I think, some people have kind of framed the COVID pandemic as being, in so many levels, just like the intersection with a racial pandemic. And I think it would be helpful to just share that, Black and Brown communities are being disproportionately impacted, particularly around the rates of death in proportion to their populations. And there's so many statistics you can look into. The CDC and NPR have put together some really good articles. But in some states for both Black and Brown communities, the rate is 3 to 4 times higher than white populations in comparison. So it's a really big issue. And I think, beyond this, we actually have kind of racial disparities in every other institution. And so the pandemic has actually just exacerbated the disparities that are already there. And, I think so many of us are familiar what's happening right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it probably, because you're on this call, have been in some way involved in the conversation about race and systemic racism in our country. And I think, there's a number, I'll actually kind of forward to this slide first, but this is a little piece that an artist did, that, racism is also a pandemic that's kind of been long standing in our society for many, many years. And we have a deep history of kind of building institutions that are wrought with disparities, everything from the criminal justice system to health, housing and land, education, wealth, and employment. And so when we have a pandemic meet an already really deep level of systemic disparities, it's the perfect storm on so many levels. So I think what's happening in some ways is that, and this is typical, but nonprofits, in crisis planning might might want to put equity on the back burner because this is kind of a crisis, and you want to be able to make sure that organizations are strong and that you've got really good systems in place. But sometimes we get into crisis mode, we forget we forget that we still need to make the pivots to come out of this storm okay. And so if we don't center equity in our crisis planning now, we'll only have further exacerbated racial challenges, disparities, and unrest as we move forward. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that, is that the intersection between I think what we're learning about systemic racism and the COVID pandemic is super interconnected. And there's, different communities are experiencing this in different ways. The impact is kind of most unfairly when it comes to particularly, rate of hospitalization and rate of death. Black communities are disproportionately impacted, and that's true across all other institutions, other communities of color, undocumented populations in prison, people with disabilities, and of course seniors. So in some ways, these communities are the communities that are most disproportionately impacted, and particularly when we think about seniors of color, people with disabilities of color, when you think about how those different populations intersect, oppression and disparities just grow. And so these are the communities that are on the margins that I think really, really need to be highlighted when we're thinking about our equity work. And this is just a quote that really struck me. It's, by the Society of Thoracic Surgeons of all groups, but just that racism cannot be tolerated or ignored. It jeopardizes safety and it undermines public health. So I think, we're becoming more clued into that. I think so many people in our communities are getting more and more attuned to really what is racism. I think we've thought about it so much, like person to person, and we've thought of it more in terms of discrimination. When really it's a system of institutions and history that kind of uphold different outcomes for different communities that are unfair. And I think, a lot of people ask kind of, so what does really equity mean? And I think for a lot of people, this will probably be review, but equity is very different than equality. And this is an image that I like that kind of illustrates it. But if we pump the same amount of resources into a community that's been historically disadvantaged and not invested in, we get the same results. It's like both kind of, even though you're pumping in the same results, you're not actually dealing with the history of disinvestment. And so equity is about making things right and making things fair, and making sure that we channel the resources into communities that have been the most disinvested in, so that we can actually enjoy anything like equality. So equity really is about justice and fairness. It's about repairing the damage that's been done and making sure that we set up new systems that help nourish and heal the damage. So I'll just take a pause now. Are there any kind of quick questions or comments to include in this conversation? Okay. Well, thanks for just listening so intently. I'd love to make room for just, whatever folks have to share as we go, but I'll just keep going unless there's anything else.
There are a couple comments in the chat box, Hannah, just saying this is really helpful. People are appreciative of it, so yeah.
Great. I'm so glad. Yeah, and there'll be more opportunity to, I think, discuss this as we move forward into some of the activities. So right, this is the reality that we're swimming in our work, in our organizations, in our society. And, there's a lot of different ways to think about, I think, what equity work looks like and isn't. I think there's a lot of, people hear diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's like the hot new thing. And we don't always fully, I think, I think for those of us who probably have been involved in training and workshops and education, you've probably gotten this breakdown and are familiar with it. But I always thought it's helpful to review. But essentially, when we talk about diversity, we're really talking about the quantity of different perspectives, the quantity of different people at the table. Inclusion is about making sure that diversity of perspectives has power and voice and influence over organizational culture. So they have to be included in the shaping of the organization. They can't just be at the table and just kind of like, check, we've got our diversity, we're totally good. We have to really make sure that our organizational culture and our agendas are reflective of those voices too. And then equity really is about the outcomes, the results. So, we can have diversity and inclusion at the table, but if we're not producing equitable results in our work, we're not doing equity work. So all three actually are really critical and have to go together and really support one another. It's almost kind of like a wheel, like they all kind of keep each other turning. And really, if you're doing equity work, you're able to keep diversity and inclusion at the table. So they really mutually support one another. But ultimately, equity is about results. Any quick questions here? Okay. And then just feel free to type a question in the chat box. I know Nicole's, you're managing chat box, so you can feel free to interrupt me if anything comes up.
And Hannah, Leticia shared a comment in the chat also about not only the amount of investment, but the type of investment and how resources are allocated, that also matters. So it's a really important point. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when we really listen to what communities need, we know what resources are valuable. So I think we have to really make sure that the resources and the redistribution of things is relevant, for the communities that we're working with. So what types of outcomes, when results are we looking for? And I really like this because this is, this kind of maps it out. It's from an organization called Create Equity, which is an arts organization. But really you're looking for a diversity of that's reflective of the communities. You're looking to build prosperity in communities of color. Redistribution of resources, the right resources, to heal, I think, the lack of investment, and then self-determination, so that particularly people of color who've been impacted have ownership over shaping the life and decision-making in their communities. We don't always have, the people in power aren't always representative of all of our communities. And I think if you just look at nationwide, the majority of decision makers still to this day, are white men. And nothing wrong with having white men in positions of power, but if white men make up the majority and we have disproportionate results for communities of color, there's something wrong with the system, the representation in the system. So I think that's what we're trying to move towards, right? That we have leadership and power representation that creates results for our whole community, that helps uplift, I think, the places that are broken, and and that we're reflective in our decision making and our agenda. This is another thing, I think, just to kind of, how does this work happen? But the Government Alliance on Racial Equity put this together. And I've noticed a lot of organizations approach their equity work in this way. And I think it's a really effective just framework for how to do equity work. And so many of us start with the area around normalizing, making sure that we're all educated, that we're sharing common language, that we have a shared analysis, that we're having regular normalized conversations about racial equity, because a lot of us are just learning and growing, and each one of our organizations is a pod for learning and growing and innovation. So it starts a lot with conversation and just normalizing and analysis and learning. Organizing is kind of another layer, making sure that you're partnering with communities in some of the key decision making. So that's an area I really want us to be able to focus on today, since I see that as kind of the center of this. And that your operation, a lot of people are really interested in operationalizing equity. And I think it's amazing, because it's where the practices and policies, like how do we establish habits that keep the wheel of equity going? And so GARE usually recommends using racial equity tools, and particularly a racial equity impact assessment, which is just a simple guide of questions that you refer to every time you make a key decision or every time you roll out a new project or a new initiative. So those are kind of the framework that they use. And just for reference, I'll be sharing all of these slides with everybody after today. So this is the racial equity tool that they refer to. You know, and there's a lot of boxes here and a lot of questions, and it's not linear, and you don't actually have to, you know, start in any one place or the other. I think this is something, you know, just from me working at the Arts Council, something that we've slowly built over time, you know, not even explicitly, but as I've kind of revisited this, like, oh, wow, this is a tool that's really, really helpful in kind of guiding what we prioritize. A big place that I started in my work was around partnership. How can we continually partner with communities most impacted by racism and inequality? And how can we center their voice and their needs in our work? So I think that's a beautiful and super valuable place just to start. And then, you know, some of the other kind of guiding questions is then when you get to your planning, you know, who benefits most by this proposal or initiative or decision? What are some of the strategies we can use to improve the consequences or to advance racial equity? You know, what's our plan for implementing those strategies? And how will we hold ourselves accountable? How can we maintain some level of strength in this? And then of course, going to kind of vision and data, what's our vision really for the future? How do we measure progress and what information do we need? So these are it's just kind of a sample of questions that would guide you. But what I like about it is kind of put into boxes of just like what will help guide us around this, you know. And just to share a quick story, you know, at the Arts Council, I was really lucky to have joined the organization 3 years ago when they already had a vision. It wasn't super fully crafted, but through our strategic plan, they really wanted to make sure that the Arts Council was becoming a leader for equity and inclusion in the arts, and that we would really center artists of color and artists in Watsonville in our work. So that was the vision. And when I got to join, I got to kind of help flush that out through the Arts Council's grants program. So the place, of course, that I started was through partnership. How can I get to know community and find out what does it mean? You know, what are the biggest priorities for artists of color and artists in Watsonville? Knowing what they most need, it helped me to kind of reshape what the grants program focused on. What were the grants program objectives? What should some of our, you know, then getting to planning and implementing, what should some of our strategies be for outreach and engagement in the grants program? How do we make the grants program more representative of the community through our panel, you know, review process, through, you know, basically who kind of our decision-making team would be. So slowly but surely, I really kind of started in the partnership realm to make sure that our plan, how we implemented it, and how we held ourselves accountable to it was informed, and that I was actually just working side by side. I really brought a lot of people in to the organization and into kind of a planning committee that we'd established. And then I learned a lot about our data, you know, that we had huge racial disparities in our grants program when I first started. And I knew that if we wanted to match the, you know, the demographic makeup of our county, we'd have a long way to go, you know. So so I got to track over time, what am I learning, you know, as I'm doing more outreach, and we're actually giving more grant money, and we're resolving some of those disparities. What's working, what's not working? So over time, I think these questions really supported my work with the grants program. And I'd just be curious from anybody from the group if there's anything like this that you're using in your work, or any of these questions that you feel like is guiding your equity work.
There are a couple comments in the chat, Hannah. I don't know if you want to address them briefly while you're on this slide. So one is just a quick question about, do you use GARE and their tools and framework? Answer that one first.
Yeah, so this is the GARE racial equity tool. They have a whole guide for operationalizing racial equity, and then another guide for initiating your own racial equity tool yourself, which is basically you just kind of design the questions that you need for your organization. So yeah, this is GARE is I think just like one of the most helpful resources. Race Forward is another great framework, and they have a whole guide of questions, like a list of questions that you can help pull from. It's like a category of questions, and you can kind of create a question that matches some of these category goals, like, you know, partnering with communities, engaging, identifying stakeholders so that you can make sure that you're including that in your planning. So yeah, Race Forward and GARE. Thanks for that question.
And then would this be a good time, Hannah, to talk about how an organization, particularly a nonprofit, might use this if they're trying to think about how to increase representation and diversity on their board of directors, knowing that a lot of times the very structure and expectations of board members can itself be the barrier to many people participating and volunteering their time. And so if someone is really interested in increasing equity in terms of their board leadership and organizational leadership, could you maybe give us a couple quick examples of how a tool like this might help?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. And I think this is where the partner piece is so valuable. It's like, how can we continually partner with communities most impacted? And we'll get to an activity after this that I actually think will help guide that specific question. But when you think about the communities most impacted locally, you know, and so for the Arts Council's example, we knew that we weren't serving Watsonville as thoroughly as we wanted to. You know, for a countywide organization, and we had so little funding going to Watsonville, we acknowledged, okay, that's a really big disparity for us. It's also a big disparity for the county as far as investment goes. And so we're like, we really just need, we use this as, I think, without really knowing that we're using a racial equity tool, just because it was a priority in our strategic plan to say, okay, we really need to bring on board membership from Watsonville. Who are some local leaders that we can start to build relationships with, that are passionate about the arts, and I think who would bring a lot of leadership and voice and perspective to the organization. And so over the last few years, we've gotten a couple board members from Watsonville, and I think this question is something that we have kind of a board recruitment committee. I think that this could be really valuable for. So I think, yeah, helping to identify who the communities are most impacted, that I think this would definitely help with. And then maybe who's burdened by, who's most burdened. I think this question on planned, like who benefits or is most burdened by, you know, the subject in our work. You know, maybe it's arts funding, maybe it's in health and wellness, you know, in whatever kind of sector that you're working in, who's kind of, I think it kind of comes back to the partnership piece, who's getting benefit and who isn't. So I think this would actually, some pieces of it could be really helpful for board recruitment. It's best, I think, probably in the, you know, implementation too, you could kind of think about what would it take for us to get to building relationships with some of those leaders, being able to be in a position to invite them and meaningfully invite them into the organization. I think there's probably additional considerations for board recruitment because you guys remember that slide where it's like diversity, inclusion, equity. Sometimes our organizations have really deeply steeped values and culture that makes it really hard for new people coming in with really brilliant ideas. Sometimes there can be just like a closed offness to new ideas about how to reshape programs, how to redesign some of the budgeting and things. And these can be, it can be threatening for people who are used to being in positions of power and who are used to managing the work in a very specific way. So we think we have to, another whole topic that I would love to talk with the group about is about organizational culture, and how to make pivots around organizational culture, because that's actually what makes inclusion possible and makes an openness available to be more innovative in engaging communities who tend to be on the margins in our work and not at the center of power and decision making. So thanks for that question. I gave you a much longer probably answer than you needed, but we have another activity that I think will help with recruitment. Okay, great. So I'll move on to this. I think this next piece is, you know, where is it most helpful to use a racial equity impact tool? And I think it's really valuable for budgeting when you roll out your budget to use these questions as a guide, or to come up, what are the questions that are most relevant for us when we're thinking about budgeting. When you're making your pivots around policy creation or program creation or eliminating programs and all of these things, these questions are super, super helpful for guiding you. Employee development and recruitment and hiring, and then particularly community engagement. And I think back to kind of like any new initiatives or proposals. And so many of us, are making really big decisions and changes to programs and budgets right now. So the racial equity tool might be helpful to guide you in, where you need to make the necessary cuts, where you need to create some innovation, how to pivot to kind of center equity, because I think that's what's so helpful about this tool is that it helps kind of the questions help reorient you to prioritizing equity. And I think so many of us, we've got our systems and processes, but I know at the Arts Council, as an example, when we would put together an event, sometimes it would just be program by program, they'd be on their own. And then finally we decided, let's come up with, an event planning kind of checklist that every time any program, puts together an event, that we'll get an event team together and we'll make sure to go through this checklist. And so we've made sure to include equity questions in our event checklist. So we have an equity lens baked into, our event planning. So that's another example of how you could use a tool like this. But really, again, the tool is just a simple set of questions that help guide your prioritization of equity. So wherever you need to put these questions into what you are already doing or incorporate them into any kind of planning guide that you have, it's just how do you center equity so that it's a part of the conversation. Any quick questions here before I continue? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So the next piece that I'll move towards is really around exploring this, how do we identify communities most impacted? How do we identify people to work with and partner with? And then how do we partner to do this work? Because this is such a critical part of the work. We can't really do equity work without centering communities most impacted. And, in crisis planning, I think so many people, think these decisions have to happen quickly. If we worry about a whole community engagement plan, that just might take forever. And, how will we ever have the time to do all of it? Just way more work on our hands. But I think one of the arguments in COVID planning and what I've seen other organizations really emphasize in their messaging is that equity decisions and emergency and crisis planning can actually happen if you have the right people in the room, the right values in the room, and the right lens, the right priorities centered. So I think when you have all of that, and ideally, of course, we're not able to meet in person as this picture shows, but that we're finding a way to gather virtually, I think, to make some of these decisions. And I think one of the things I want to highlight is, again, this will probably be pretty relatable, I think, for all folks, but, the power that organizations hold is, and kind of the positional and formal authority is essentially the center of the organization. It's where all of the decisions get made. It's kind of where the agenda gets set. It's where the budgeting comes from. So it's kind of the center of the organization. Even if we have kind of community centered, so much of the decision making and power is really with our position, whoever has positional authority in the organization. So that's oftentimes board, directors, managers, again, where decisions get made, budgets, people are hired and fired, programs are approved, boundaries are set, where structures and accountability are designed and implemented. So these decisions often get made, kind of within a specific kind of circle. We have in nonprofits and in institutions across the board, this is just a huge part of our society, we have hierarchical, for the most part, structures. Often folks who fall outside of that decision making tend to be staff with little or no positional authority, our clients, potentially our volunteers, maybe community members that there might even be people that are off the piece of paper who aren't even included. But I think one of the ways this is helpful is just to identify, just to acknowledge where power lies in an organization. And sometimes I think that can be triggering, and I think people, there's different ways that we may acknowledge or not acknowledge, but it's just part of the society that we live in. We've got power structures, and our nonprofits have them too. So I maybe just take a minute to acknowledge just where kind of the center of power is in your organization or in your work. And this can be kind of like a quick little journal jot down on a piece of paper. And so what I'd like to share is, there's a framework that I really appreciate from Compass Point that's really simple. For those of you who know Compass Point, it's a kind of a professional development organization in Oakland who's been doing work throughout the years to support nonprofits in their growth and leadership development. But they've really taken a pivot over the last, I think, 10 years towards really centering racial justice. And this has been a key part of their framework, is a margin to center framework. So acknowledging who the folks are at the center, the individuals and groups that are kind of in positions of power and have formal authority, are often the folks who benefit most from structural privilege because they're positioned on a top powerful role. So they have structural privilege inside the organization because they get to make more decisions. They also tend to have pretty huge workloads, but I think so do folks on the front lines. Then the way that they identify too is that then there's kind of an outer circle outside of that, which is the margins. It's kind of the individuals and groups that experience the most structural oppression and marginalization. And oftentimes, right, we know that in our organizations and institutions, the two do not match. Often folks who are working at the margins or who are at the margins aren't always reflected in the center, right? There can often be some really big disparities in representation. And again, this is just something that's a part of the way our society's kind of been developed over time. There's a whole societal and historical context for this. So all of us have been really well conditioned to uphold kind of a difference between center and margins. And this actually comes from bell hooks. For those of you who are familiar with bell hooks, just raise your hand. So she is a Black feminist philosopher, author, and one of the things that she really highlighted, and this is kind of her framework, is that in order for a margin to even exist, is like the centering of power is how a margin gets created. So it's by consolidating and holding power in one place, you create margins. And I know that in order for us to do our work, we have to, we have to give people different jobs, and some people position decision making. But ultimately, so many of the decisions that happen from the center, if they're not representative of the margins, they create disproportionate, unfair impacts on the margins. So this is why equity, the word, exists, right? Is to create fairness between the margin and center. So I think what I would like to just share too is that, if you have people from the margins deeply engaged and you find some way to engage people from the margins in the center of decision making, you will have more equitable results. You will engage lived experience and lived wisdom into decision making and program creation and innovation. And if you're in a position to really hear and center those values, those agendas, those priorities in your organization, you will be able to make a pivot towards a higher level of relevancy with these communities, a higher level of representation, and a higher level of service. So really, equity work is so much about engaging the margins meaningfully in the power centers of our work. And so that kind of speaks back to that question about board leadership. We absolutely want to have representative board leadership to make sure that we're reflecting the margins too, so that we don't have to have this marginal impact, right? So I want to invite you to do an activity with me. And for those of you, I think, who joined right at the beginning or early, then Nicole shared that it would be great for you to have a blank piece of paper and a marker. And I want you to just kind of draw a middle circle and then an outside circle on your piece of paper. And so as a way to just kind of guide this framework and this kind of what is essentially a power analysis inside your own organization and work, to identify who are those kinds of, you got to journal initially, who are those kind of folks, who are those groups and individuals that have the most power and authority in your organization, to kind of place some of those folks at the center. And then identify some of the individuals and groups in your work, in your community, that tend to be the most impacted by structural oppression, by racism, into the margins. This takes just a few minutes to do. And you can think about even inside your own constituency, if you see some communities on the margins, or communities that you might not serve, but maybe you want to serve or you should be serving.
And
But
Hannah,
essentially,
there's a question that was asked in the chat that might be good to answer as people are thinking about and doing this exercise about how do you do this kind of mapping and power analysis without ending up tokenizing marginalized individuals and communities?
yes, that's a really, really good question. I am actually going to get to that one in just a moment. I really like that question. I think that is I would argue probably one of the most important questions, just because of the way that equity, I think that's where equity work can really fail, is through tokenization. So yeah, after people have a chance to do this activity, I would like to speak to that.
Great.
Thank you. So now what I'd like you to do is identify where you might land on that map. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle, maybe it's on an edge, maybe it is in the center, maybe it's on the outside. And worth saying that, no shame or harm in just where we each land inside of this, right? This is a societal makeup and structure we've inherited. So we all get kind of haphazardly placed depending on all sorts of factors. So just identifying where you land in your organization. And I think what's worth sharing is, when I first did this activity, I went to a Compass Point workshop. And at the time, I was in the middle. I was considered, a manager. I wasn't a part of the director's team, but I wasn't fully on the margins either, because I had some positional authority in managing a program. And so it was a complex place to be, navigating between the two. I often felt like a bridge, but didn't really have any really formal power involved in the top of the organization. And partly through, I think, through our redesign of our equity work at the Arts Council, our executive director was like, yeah, we really need to make sure we have a voice on our directors team. So I later joined the directors team. And so now I would categorize myself as kind of somewhere maybe on the outside, but still connected to the center, or kind of on the outskirts of the center, since I get to have quite a bit of influence on the way that we guide our work now. So that was a way, I think, in which, at least for our executive director, to think about how do we bring in some of the marginal voice and perspective into the center of decision making. And so many of us are just on all angles, and some of our organizations have really strict structures, and not including marginal voices on staff or marginal voices in community into the center. There's a lot of, I think, this is kind of an unnamed, kind of checked value inside nonprofits and inside institutions across society, is a certain type of power hoarding, or kind of a power keeping. There's kind of a belief that some things need to be done in a certain way. So that's something culturally that I think is really, really important for us to eventually start to unpack. Is tender and vulnerable as that place is for so many of us, that's a really, really important piece to name and start to work out, I think, in our nonprofits. Because we can't actually talk about equity if we're not talking about about power differential. Power has such a big influence on what happens and results for different people. So now I want you to identify, part of the kind of racial equity impact tool that we looked at, that kind of strip of questions, is, how can you partner with communities most impacted? So when you're thinking about, kind of who you have identified on the margins, whether that's staff members that represent or work kind of on the front lines, or that's people in communities, I think it's the organizers and frontline workers in these that are most connected to communities in the margin, communities of color, that have the biggest insight into what's happening in communities, what's important, what the priorities should be, what's most needed. So I want you to think of, can you think of, even, I say 3 to 5 people here, but even if you can think of less, that you can identify who's really working, deeply, I think, in marginal communities, that you might be able to partner with. So just adding those names to your list. And if you, for some reason, can't think of anyone, maybe one person who could help connect you to more people, and then it kind of slowly builds. And if for some reason at all you can't think of anyone, you can put me down and I will totally help hook you up with the right people. So this is just a practice to, I think, help jog thinking about, there are some really critical voices. If you can identify people on the margins that you could partner with, chances are you're really missing some critical voices from decision-making and planning at the center, right? And the idea is to make sure you've got that representation, you've got those leadership voices helping to inform and working with the center to come up with new solutions for how to get through this period, this kind of crisis period, but also to come out on the other end with a much better impact and a much better plan that's more representative of our community, and acknowledges, I think, just the historic lack of investment, right, that's happening in our community, just from those previous slides. So I'll speak back to that point that was asked about how to not how to not tokenize people as you bring them in. And I just wanted to share, I think what's happening right now with the Black Lives Matter movement is unprecedented. It's the largest, movement of protests in the history of the world, which I thought was really, really incredible. We had more marches than ever seen before. And so this is this is a classic example of change initiated from the margins, because we don't see it at the center of our decision making. When you think of our national, where does power get held nationally, right? We don't see Black and brown communities. And so change at the margins from the Black community is really where this needed to happen. So I think, using this as an example, so many institutions have not up until this point really been able to hold the agenda and needs that have come up through this movement, at the center of their organizations. So I think one of the ways to not tokenize is to make sure that what's most important to these communities is at your table, is prioritized at the center, that when you bring people in, you don't just check a box to be like, okay, great, they're here, I'll listen to you, but actually we can't actually do any of that stuff. Well, I don't think that's too far. We're not going to have the space and time to do that. So a lot of it requires a certain openness from organizations, and maybe even some allocation of resources to be like, no, we really are going to use this fund, or we're going to use this program or this team of people to really dedicate some time and openness to equitable solutions. And as an example, this is just starting. So, I'm not tooting too many horns, but the Arts Council, we're just starting to think about this. And we have a recognition that even though we've brought, some more diversity into our directors team, brought a little bit more diversity onto our board, we are still not reflective of our community. Our directors team, I'm the only person of color. On our board, we've got, I think, 4 people of color, and so it's getting further, but it's not quite there. And so we designed an equity advisory team and this is still an area we have a lot of work. We just started this, so we're learning a lot. But it was to acknowledge that we need an advisory team, because our organization really needs those voices and those perspectives if we're going to be successful. And so that's one example of a way to bring in, but not just to listen to what they have to say and be like, "That's great, that was awesome. See you next month." We won't do any of it, right? To really make sure that we're set up so that we have some resources to back what comes out of that committee, and we have some way to bring what that committee shares into our strategic plan for the next few years. We're in a position where we're going to be starting a new strategic 3 years. We do kind of 3-year strategic plans. We're in the last year of our strategic plan now. We'll be starting a new one, and so this team will be critical to shaping. What should be at the center of our plan. So I think you have to really be ready to make sure that the inclusion piece is right. We saw those kind of three squares, that you're not just hitting. I think if you just hit the diversity square, that is tokenizing. You're not getting very far. I mean, people might be excited just to be there, but chances are people are there because they really want to see something shift and change, or they really want to see something grow. So you have to make sure that their voice, their values, the agenda is deeply embedded, and is centered. I think, so much of what Cora talks about is centering equity. And I think a lot of people have asked, what does centering equity really mean? But it's figuring out who in your community is being most impacted by what's happening, and centering what they're saying in your work, really centering their values and their priorities in what you do, and centering their leaders, finding new, whether it's alternative structures or using the current structures you have, or both at the same time, like what we're trying to do with the Arts Council, to center that leadership voice. So I think that's how you deal with tokenizing. The other thing I'd like to mention about that is compensation. I think, people are like, oh, great, I'll just, we'll get some volunteers to the table. But people of color, particularly those who are leaders in their community, are highly sought out and overworked and very busy, and probably working in a job and many other projects. And so I think it's really worthwhile to think about, if you bring in consultants into your work, to help guide your work, and you pay a consultant, I think it's worth it to look at your community and see them as consultants. You're asking them to do work that you haven't figured out quite yet how to represent in your organization. So finding a way to allocate some resources to compensate some an advisory team, to bring in advisors, and whether it's a grant to their organization, if you're on that scale, a grant to their organization to ask them to be, to join a thought cohort or a thought team, or if it's just individuals. I think it's really worthwhile to not, I think that's another way to not tokenize, right, is to compensate people for the labor that because it is essentially labor. And if people are interested in, how to set up a structure for stipends, I had no idea how to start that out with our equity team, but I just asked community members, and then consulted with a few other people. How, what should the pay be? How often should it be? How often, how much time are we asking people? And then you can slowly start to come up with a plan. But I'm happy to be a thought partner if you're thinking about coming up with an equity team for your organization. There are so many good ways to do that. And also, GARE has a whole guide on building racial equity teams as a strategy for racial equity. So teams, I know a lot of people have a team internally. So that's one place to start, and you can think about how to make sure that that team's more representative too.
And I just wanted to draw your attention to a question in the chat that's related to tokenism, and it's about the different perspectives of partners who are of the community itself, or just working more intensively in it, and just these different layers of connection to the community.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So I think, that you can have a variety of kind of different players involved, depending on, one, how much interest, right? You don't want to bring people in who don't have the capacity or interest. You want, if you've got really passionate community people who would like to join this conversation, they'd be an excellent person to engage. If you've got community leaders that you feel like you have or that you can build a close relationship with, they can be engaged too. We've got, just an example is, we've got organizational leaders, but we also have individual artists who just care about what's happening at the Arts Council. And so it just depends who has the capacity and interest, and who you can start to form a relationship with, who you see, oh yeah, this person really could be available and interested in helping us guide our work. Thanks for that question. Okay, great. So I want to create a little opportunity for you to just connect with somebody else about just what's coming up for you, how this activity went for you, kind of identifying center margins and where you are inside of it. Are there ideas, kind of who did you identify and why? Are there ideas for a person that could be a connection to other people? How can you kind of use your position to move some of those marginal voices into the center of the organization? Or was there just anything that was really hard about this that you would like to talk, kind of talk about? So I want to give everybody about 10 minutes in pair shares, and then we'll bring it back to the main group, and I'll have a little bit more time for questions. So Nicole, the Nicoles, maybe you guys, I think, will be able to handle the logistics of pair shares.
I'm finishing getting the pairs set up to go to breakout rooms. Nicole, do you want to briefly explain what will happen so people know what to expect?
Sure. If you haven't participated in a Zoom breakout room before, you'll be automatically directed to another space with another person, in this case, a pair. Later on, we'll do some small groups. But that will all happen automatically. You don't have to do anything. When you're in your group, you will see the other person's image or name, and you two can have a short conversation. There will be a timer that tells you exactly how the 10 minutes are elapsing. You'll have the questions here in the chat, so you might want to pay attention to those, and we'll send them out again too. But you'll also get a 1-minute warning for when the pair share conversation is drawing to a close, and then everything will happen in reverse. You'll be automatically sent back to this group. It'll just take a moment, depending on your Wi-Fi speed, etc. But just as Hannah says, trust the process. You'll get there, you'll get back without having to do anything. You don't have to click on anything or change any settings. It'll all happen for you, but just be patient if it's not happening immediately, and enjoy your conversation and your pair share.
And then if you are participating just by phone, you might want to make sure that you are unmuted, and might even want to turn on your camera if you can before you head out into your breakout room, just so that when you appear, everyone can see you. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. I think one group's going to have 3 people. Everybody else will just have one other partner. So we'll see you back in, I'm going to do about 8 minutes, Hannah.
Perfect, that's great. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Any just quick kind of takeaways or questions from your pair shares? Anything that came up, or anything that was hard, or any questions that you have? And thank you so much, Nicole, for managing the chat box. I appreciate that. Oh, it looks like we have a hand up for, let's see. I have to look at participants. Looks like we have a hand up for Jane. Yeah.
Hi. One of the things that occurs to me from our tri-share was that there is a center and then there's the margin, but that interface line is kind of fluid in terms of the positions we have, or the interface, the nature of the interface that we have. There's no answers there, but it is just, there's kind of rings of influence, and we just stressed the importance. I felt the importance of just honoring the relationship, and trying to create mutual respect and greater understanding.
Yeah, Jane, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I think you're so right. So much of our work, as far as our work goes, we kind of, flow between all of them. And I definitely interact so much with the center and my position, and so much, I think, inside when you're looking at the power structure of an organization, I'm working so much in the margins to engage that work, with our center and vice versa. But I think when you think about the center as being kind of the power of where decision making is, there can sometimes be a more clear distinction on who gets to participate in decision making. And I think some organizations have actually gotten good at making sure there's more fluidness around decision making. And I know we've done a lot of that at the Arts Council and trying to make sure our decision making happens kind of where whoever's closest to the issue or to the community or to the program gets to make the decision. So we're trying to make sure that that area is more fluid too. So yeah, that is totally the goal, is to make sure decision making and power gets shared. Okay, great. So I'm gonna, I think just because of time, if there's other questions, I'd actually love the Nicoles to collect those, and maybe if we have time at the end, I can get to those. But just to make time for some of the other activities, I'll keep us moving. So I just want to share that, you know, when we talk about power and authority, really all of us who have positions in community and positions in nonprofits have power and authority. And we are all kind of influencing so many different realms in our work. So there's a lot of different, you know, this is kind of a nice framework. It's levels of oppression and change, where change can happen. On the personal level inside organizations, it's a lot around culture, feelings, beliefs, values. There's a lot of approach to doing training there because that's kind of what shifts some of the personal aspects of work. Institutional, or I should say interpersonal, is kind of the relationships between people, investigating that. So sometimes people will have racial affinity groups or breakout kind of, they'll do, you know, kind of dialoguing around how relationship treatment behaviors, how that plays out in organizations. That has a lot to do with culture too. Institutions, that is our policies, practices, rules, systems, procedures. So a lot of change happened here. And then cultural, this is really what influences so much of why we even are where we are today, is our worldview. It's our history, it's our stories, our shared values, all of the unwritten rules that swim under the surface that some of us may be conscious or unconscious of. Media, public opinion, norms, group dynamic. So these are all of the different places where change can happen. And there's different strategies to address each place. But I think for so many of us who are doing kind of acute, you know, planning for COVID and kind of crisis planning and decision making at this time, so much is happening on the institutional level and maybe on the personal level. But I just kind of wanted to share this as a framework. And thinking about the way we bring people into shifting change on each of these levels. And we are making decisions all the time, definitely that impact the institutional. So that's a place we'll kind of focus on for this next activity. And really, we just want to make sure that we are kind of share, you know, the share the air kind of piece, that we're really bringing our values in when we're doing when we're making our decisions. So this next activity is a way to, you know, how do we center equity in all of the kind of choices that we make that impact our programs, our organization, and who we work with. So these are some examples of decision-making points, which with Race Forward, they call these choice points. These are where you have really clear choices to make, and this is where you can take that pause that we practiced and, you know, hold your values that I think that we've talked about and then also maybe even invite other people to come in to make sure that that choice point is guided by equity. So we all have personal choice points. You know, we make consumer decisions all the time about where to shop, what to buy, or what to boycott. Examples for where to influence this is, I don't know if there's anybody from the Diversity Center on this call, but they came up with a guide for supporting Black-owned businesses in Santa Cruz counties, I think Santa Cruz and Monterey County. So that's a way to help influence choice points that impact, you know, personal decisions that support the local economy. Another personal choice point, you know, what causes to get involved with, what organizations to support or be a donor for. Socializing, who do we spend time with? Who do we have in our network? Who do we get close to? Also, who do we network with? Voting, which candidates or causes are we supporting, particularly locally? So those are some of our personal choice points that can have a really big impact on equitable outcomes and on our communities. Institutional choice points, and this is where I would love us to spend some time, particularly just because we're in this kind of time of pivoting and changing and planning, is what to change and prioritize in our programs and work plans. In budgeting, what items to prioritize, add or cut, right? These are big decision-making points. Personnel, who to hire, who to let go of, who to retain, promote, and develop as leaders. In our policy development, what do we propose or modify? And practices, kind of what are our routine habits? What are our checklists? What are the different things that we use to influence our work? Routines, oops, and I'll just go back to that. Yeah, so what are our practices? So if there's anything that strikes you from this list, just jot it down on a piece of paper or on a notepad or, online, however you're recording notes. If any of these resonate with you. And in a moment, we'll be able to add, brainstorm some of our own personal outside of this. But this is just to kind of get the conversation going. So I want you to actually take a few minutes to just journal right now. What are some institutional choice points that you're encountering regularly? Especially right now, just as you're, I think all of us are at a crossroads with our organizations. So what are some kind of key decision-making points that are having an impact at maybe daily, weekly, monthly, annually? On a daily basis, it might be who you're choosing to email, whose emails you're responding to, who you reach out to. On a weekly basis, it might be what's on the staff agenda. On a monthly basis, it might be reviewing, budget, maybe that's more of an annual choice point. But you kind of get the gist, just what are those kind of key decision-making points? Daily, weekly, monthly, annually. And I'll give you more than 2 minutes. I'll give you about, maybe 4 minutes, just to kind of jot down. So I think, why this is so important and why I had us rooted in values first is that, ideally in a perfect world, the impact of our decisions and our values would align, right? They would be totally congruent. But on an institutional level, we often have impacts that aren't always, I think, creating the equity that we want. We're also kind of baked into systems that aren't really set up for equity. So we're being asked as nonprofits, I think, to this is why systems change, I think, is such a, kind of growing conversation, is we're having to rework a system that we inherited that inherently doesn't work for community. So choice points is a really good way to interrupt that, to start to identify what's happening in impact. And when we identify choice points, that's where we can be like, okay, so those are some key decision-making points for an institution. If you can identify where those places are, then you can say, this is where we'd actually want to bring in a racial equity impact assessment tool, or those, basically that's that guide of equity questions to help inform that decision. So if you're seeing that, wow, our staff meetings could be so much more meaningful, what if we use the racial equity impact tool to influence what the topics are for our staff meetings, or to influence the way we set our budgeting priorities, or to influence the way we do our strategic planning? Ideally, those choice points, you help to identify where to put that tool. So this next activity is kind of going to guide us in asking or answering some of those questions that a tool would. And I just want to share too that, choice points oftentimes in institutions, personal, of course, we have personal power, but choice points in institutions are often shaped by who is at the center in our organizations. So much of I think what the margin to center framework is trying to encourage us to do is to make sure choice points aren't just decided by the center, they're also being shaped by the margins. People who are on the front lines, people in the middle, just that the choice points I think are being informed by the full community. So I want you to identify what is, kind of looking at all of your choice points that you wrote down, maybe just choose one key policy, program, practice, budget decision, one really big thing under consideration that you think will have an impact on communities of color right now in your community. You can just circle it, or if you want to write it down. And we're going to specifically work with this one that you choose, one that you think could really have a really big impact. And I want you to just journal really quick, what are some of the desired results and outcomes of that choice point that you currently have? And now I want you to do a quick little minute, also some more. We get to do lots of journaling today, so thank you for having your notepads and pens ready, or computer screens. But so now that you've identified that kind of one choice point that you want to work with, I want you to just kind of journal, what are some kind of alternative actions that you could do to make sure that that has more equitable impact? What are some kind of key equity questions you'd want to inform that decision? And who are maybe some people you'd want to be involved in that decision? So just kind of journaling, like, what are some options for working with that choice point that could have an equitable impact? And you don't have to answer all of these questions in your journaling right now. I know I put up a lot of questions on the screen, but just that kind of, now that you've identified that number one, you're just generating some kind of journaling options for number two based on what we've talked about so far. Does anybody have any questions at this moment? We're going to actually move into breakouts in a minute, just so you have an opportunity to discuss some of these pieces. And Nicole, I think I might have sent you some of the questions. I know, Nicole Young, you sent out the kind of discussion questions for breakouts to the group earlier,
Yeah,
but maybe we could put them in the chat box too,
yeah,
just in case.
So if you have them, if you had already printed them out, this is the time to take that, or I'm gonna include a link to the discussion questions in a Google Doc. You can also access them there. And each of your small groups will have someone who has volunteered to be a note taker for your group. So they might be using that document or just handwriting notes to share afterwards and capture some of the key themes from each of your discussions.
And I would just say, I think the key questions to talk about in your breakouts is just, what choice point did you pick? And what are some of the alternative actions that you think would help center equity for that key kind of choice point? And then if you selected a kind of new course of action, if you're like, oh, I really want to do this, I think that would be really great to share in your small groups. How big are the breakout groups, Nicole? Is it groups of 4?
They will be either groups of 3 or 4.
Okay, great. So folks probably remember that first shared agreement, share the air. So, we'll have about a little less than 20 minutes in the group. So you want to make sure that you have at least 4 minutes for each person to share. So if one of you in the group is noticing that someone's taking more than the 4 minutes, you might just invite somebody to say, let's hear from the other folks. Because I know often in breakout, sometimes we can hear some really juicy information from a couple people, but we might not get to everybody. So maybe each of you just take a few minutes to share what you're thinking and then pass it on to the next person after about 4 minutes. And so I'll pass it on to the Nicoles to let you get into breakout groups.
And then Hannah, are these still 20 minutes, or do we need to adjust that at all for?
Let's do 18 minutes.
Okay. Great. So everyone is assigned.
Yeah.
And here we go.
Thanks, everyone. So thanks for taking that time in your breakouts. This was just a way to kind of practice thinking about what are some questions and what are some ways to rethink some of these key decision-making places. But I'd actually love to hear from some of you just, what some of your key takeaways might have been, or if you have any big questions.
I'll speak.
Yeah.
I think one of the main things that we all agreed on in my group was that equity begins with self-awareness of our own privilege and our own power, and then having an open mind and a positive attitude on how we can use our privilege and power to include others. And then that's always should be a constant in any of our programs and when on all the things we're looking at. And then the COVID was just this extra thing added in that now we're kind of doing a juggling act with that. But
yeah, that is beautifully said. Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing. I mean, I think that is absolutely true. It's, you know, in all of our organizations, we actually hold a great degree of power and privilege just because we're connected to so many resources and ways of doing things. So yeah, how do we make this a constant? How do we constantly bring these key questions and this key way of thinking about centering community into our work? And one of the things I wanted to share about centering community is when we identify what the self-interest is of our community members, what's core and most important to them, and we figure out how to link that up with our interest and highlight and prioritize and invest in it, we really strengthen our organizations, and we also really strengthen our communities that are most impacted by what's happening right now. So I think that's another way to kind of touch back on how not to tokenize, or how not to just kind of check the box. Looks like there's a comment here from Rob. Let's see, I saw it pop up, but now I can't read it.
From Robin, who says that there was a theme in her group of courage to name the gap between the values of equity and the results of current policies and practices, and to commit to doing things differently.
Wonderful. Any other questions or takeaways? I'd also be curious, like, what's needed next? One of the questions I got to partner with Rhiannon, and one of my questions to her is just where do you need the most support? Like, what would be your next question, or what next step do you need help with? But I see that Lucia shared, we discussed the limits of good intentions and acknowledging the power dynamics of asking for feedback from those we are trying to serve, right? Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes that can happen as an afterthought. Sometimes we actually already have fully formed plans, and then, as an afterthought, like, oh shoot, we didn't ask about community, and so then that can happen, and it doesn't really meaningfully or authentically engage. And I think so many people lean on community for their thoughts without thinking about the piece on compensation, because compensation is such a critical part. Crystal, we talked about the importance of supporting staff of color or those working on equity, checking and asking how they're doing, what support they need. Oh my gosh, this one's beautiful. I think just from someone who is a person of color in an institution, who's often been one of the sole people who is focused on equity, it's a really, really big job, and it's hard to navigate, and there aren't a ton of peer networks are growing for it, but there isn't a ton of mentorship or people saying, here's how you do it, and we'll help you along the way. Oftentimes, I think the few people of color of staff who are working on equity are kind of like, you got it, and so I think this is so beautiful. Just what do you need? How can we make sure that you're supported in this work? Because this is actually the organization's work. It's not just your work as one staff person on the front lines are doing the equity work. It's really all of our work to support. So I think that's such a beautiful one to share. Thank you. Lucia, my organization particularly is legally barred from officially including some community members as volunteers and staff. So it's wrestling with how to still include their voice in an intentional way while still being able to do the court advocacy that is core to the work that we do. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there's some really interesting kind of bureaucratics that sometimes we have to navigate and figure out how to do work. Lucia, I'd be happy to chat with you if it's helpful to have a thought partner in navigating some of that. And I'll share my contact information with folks before we close. Yeah, I think, for us, I mean, this isn't probably a perfect solution for you, Lucia, but, coming up with alternative leadership models that are advisory and inform, and hopefully serve as a bridge to maybe some of the structures you have in place that aren't so easy to manipulate or to shift and change. Any other questions? I mean, I think the other question I had is, coming back to that one, is just, what do you need now? What do you need help with now? What would be a good next step? I'd be curious, for a future core conversation, what would you like to spend time on?
Yeah, I just wanted to lift up something Robin had mentioned earlier about how people are effectively engaging others who are in the margins for decision making, and the shift of moving from the token input issue to authentic co-creation, learning from each other locally, who feels like they're making progress with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I so appreciate that. And I think, I mean, just, from just starting this conversation with you, we had 2.5 hours just to kind of brainstorm and think through and touch on some of these topics. But it seems like a really good next step is, once you get people to the table, how to meaningfully engage, how to meaningfully set an agenda, how to meaningfully build a relationship with. Because I think so many of us are like, oh no, we know that we might not have representation. Sometimes you look out to the community and you're like, I need you to come do this, and it can feel a little extractive, like, let me grab that and put that here, rather than this really meaningfully authentic connection. And so there's a community organizing strategy that I think has been really valuable to my work over, kind of my history in nonprofits, but also this equity work, is something called one-to-ones. And it's really making sure that you build a relationship with people around what there is most important to them. And you find ways to connect self-interest. So that could even be a topic for a future conversation, is how to meaningfully build partnerships. And then once you bring partnerships to the table, how do you set the tone? How do you have a meaningful conversation that really centers those priorities?
And there's been several comments that relate to a community of practice. So from Crystal, sort of a continued peer support or learning group, starting with people on this chat or conversation. And from Leslie, really hearing from people of color who are doing this work within organizations, and how people who are in positions of power in the center of those circles can support them. And Jim talks also about developing a community of practice, which I agree, Jim, would be amazing. And just mentioning that Jim earlier had offered to share some of his ideas and practices around budgeting that was mentioned earlier. So we have all of that on a potential future conversation chat list as well.
Wonderful.
Great ideas, everyone. Keep them coming.
Well, I'll just share my contact information real quick. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me, culturalequitytraining@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to just answer any questions. And I'd really like to support the core team and just kind of thinking through what are some other offerings that we can provide to guide you along on this journey and in this work. And I really, really appreciate the piece around, for people who are already doing this work, how do we really uplift and support them? Because this is such a big job that often doesn't have a lot of support. And so I think a peer network, those are so intimately connected. Having a peer learning network, I think, helps strengthen the whole organization's ability to do this work. Because oftentimes it's just like the one or two people in the organization spend all of their time thinking about this, and occasionally they'll bring it, but really this is organizational work. So I think having a peer learning network is a good way to bring in support to both the center and to the folks who tend to work on the margins.
Thanks for that idea, Hannah. And I think you and Mireya have been your own partnership within our county. We're so fortunate to have your insights and the Arts Council's example, and so many others that would be great to lift up and connect as well. And we're so happy to have a chance to share that through this platform. And let's see if there are other questions coming in. I know our time is drawing to a close.
The last takeaway I might share unless we see any other comments is just that I highly recommend checking out Race Forward's Racial Equity Impact Assessment. I can actually attach that or send it over to the Nicole so that, usually you guys do a follow-up after the core conversations so that people have that. It's just a guide for coming up with your own questions for decision making, but also the Government Alliance on Racial Equity has a whole toolkit for developing your own racial equity tool.
Lots of tools out there to sift through and learn from, and it's nice to have your insights about which ones you found particularly helpful. I know people will want to follow up on those as well. As Hannah mentioned, we will send out a follow-up email with some of these links, but in the meantime, Nicole Young has just posted in the chat a link to a feedback survey, SurveyMonkey. We pay close attention to your feedback, and that's part of how these weekly chats and conversations get crafted. So we welcome your ideas for topics, as well as your help promoting them. If you have colleagues who couldn't attend live today, there's always a webinar live, a taped version available after the fact, and those are on our core YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to as well. And all of them are stacked there for reference. If you can just listen in on a part of it or don't have time to be here for these longer conversations, that's a good option. So, or want to go back to review some of the topics that were discussed. So we hope you got a lot out of today's session. We have coming up on our next couple of coffee chats. I'm going to go back to that slide, Nicole. We have contact information for us, as well as a preview of what's coming up next. So next week we have a conversation on environmental movements and race, and that will be with a variety of local organizations, including the Coastal Watershed Council, Save Our Shores, and O'Neill Sea Odyssey. So we encourage you to join that to explore those topics in more detail. But again, even if you don't think of yourself as connected to environmental health or environmental justice, we hope to convince you that it's connected to everything else that we're doing here. Then we also have a conversation on June 30th, same time, 10 to 11 on Tuesday, about responses to supporting older adults, particularly during COVID-19. So dealing with some of the issues of isolation and how to support people who may be particularly impacted by the limits of this crisis in our community. And then on July 7th, we're going to have an introduction to the community resilience model, which has a lot of tools that are like the ones we've discussed today, useful personally as well as organizationally within your organizational work settings. So we hope you'll join us for all of those. But again, if not, you can listen to them later. And just a huge thank you to Hannah, if we could give her a round of silent applause through our Zoom gallery here. You've got such a gift for helping people see things differently and take action, which is the really important step out of all of this. And we so appreciate you taking the time to share your talents and your insights with all of us. And we look forward to doing more of the same. So thanks. We miss you in having you locally. Hannah's moved out of the area, but she's still with us. And with Zoom, it doesn't matter.
It's true. Thank you so much, everyone, for doing this work and for being here. I think it's just really so much power in the continuity of this work. So just keeping it going and keeping yourself learning and growing. It's never been done before. So I just really appreciate all of you being here to move it forward.
Thanks. And it's great to take that out of this particular moment in history. And Nicole, I think we may have our first ever ending early. So.
Yay.
It's our little gift to everybody.
Yeah, almost every minute.
We're givers. And someone had asked, Gail had asked if we could share the link to the Core Investments YouTube channel. So that's the link that I just pasted in the chat box. Great. And we'll also send all of these Hannah's slides, the link to the recording, the actual link to the Core Investments channel on YouTube. We'll send all of that in the follow-up email within a few days.
Great, and everything you want to know about CORE is in the shared folder that you see on this slide too. So there's lots of information there, including a folder with some of the tools that Hannah's mentioned here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thanks,
great
Hannah.
day.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.